Bad
There we
now.
go.
Can I ask one question? Will we receive the slide deck from this?
I'm happy to share the slide deck, and the video will be shared as well.
Brilliant. Very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, right. I've got it. So let's just do that. Right, now this is where we go into technology and hope it all works. So let's, there we go, share that. Okay, so hopefully, if you just give me a thumbs up, you should see something that says health and safety management on your slides. People can see that. Excellent. Okay, so let's crack into this. Realistically, we have what we call drivers. So drivers are the things that make us do health and safety. And the three key drivers that you as sort of senior managers within your company have is you have your moral obligation, your legal obligations, and your financial obligations. So the moral one, I'm literally going to just cover off very quickly, because you don't want people working who have accidents at work. So you have this obligation to make sure that they go home with everything still attached. And that's from a physical point of view and also a mental health well-being point of view. So the moral obligation is there to make sure that we do things right, to look after our staff, but not just our staff, also the people who are affected by the work we do. So that could be contractors, could be members of the public, could be visitors to the areas that we're working in. So our obligation is there. So then what I want to do is just start with financial. And what we look at with the financial side is that the health and safety executive a few years ago had this program that they said, good health and safety is good business. And so what we have to look at from that point of view is to, whoops, clicking in the wrong place there, is this idea of the iceberg principle. Now, as I say, I'm going to keep this reasonably generalistic, but the basic concept is that for every £1 you would spend above the line from an insured cost point of view, there are £10 worth of uninsured costs that you are going to have to pay out, or is it going to affect the organization? So things like, clearing up the site after an accident, you can't really go and say, well, I'm going to claim for that on the insurance. I've got to repaint the wall. I've got to clean up the area. Things like investigation time. Well, it's very difficult that if I came into your organization to have a meeting with the three senior managers, each one of those is £100 an hour type person. So having a conversation with them is going to be £300 of cost that the organization is now going to have to incur, where they could have been doing something else more productive with their time. So this is where we start to look at this and say, well, for every £1 that goes out, there are roughly £10 of cost to the organisation floating around somewhere within it as well. So what we then have to think about is, well, if we've got an insured cost, obviously all of you should have employer's liability insurance. Now, this is where if an accident happens to a member of your staff, then they can make a claim and you can obviously pay out on the employer's liability. Now, what people don't realise is that this is a mandatory insurance. You have to do it. So as soon as you employ your first person, then you have to do it, with the exception of if it's a family member. So if it's a family member, the assumption is you would look after them if they were injured. So therefore, you don't need to have employer's liability insurance if you're employing your partner or your son as it goes through. The insurance has to be for a minimum of £5 million. It has to be displayed. So you have to put the certificate up where people can see it, or you need to put it onto your intranet system. Now, the bit that people don't realise is they are also meant to keep it for up to 40 years. Now, this is because you might have something like asbestosis or mesothelioma, where a person has worked for you 25 years ago. They've now been diagnosed with this medical condition, and they're now going to be coming back to you to say, well, I used to work for you and I wish to make a claim against you. So this is where if someone takes over your company, they do those due diligence checks to say, well, do you know of any liabilities, or what's happening? And these are the things you're meant to declare as you come through. So you've just got to make sure that you keep a record of who you were being insured by at the time. It doesn't have to be a physical record. It could just be a photograph as it comes through. Now, what we find is that we have this situation that when people say, well, what's the cost? Because we're talking about the cost of having an accident, of doing health and safety well. It's the sort of, oh, let's work it on the back of a fag packet sort of thing. You do a rough calculation. Now, back in the 90s, people like myself went to the HSE and said, well, look, you're asking us to do these costs and do these things. It's very difficult. Could you give us a framework in which to work? So the health and safety executive produced this thing called the instant cost calculator. So if within your own organization you have a safety team, or you as managers are having to look at, say, a near miss and say, oh gosh, that could have been expensive, what you can do is you can look at this cost calculator, which you can download from the HSE's website. And it talks about, well, what's the cost of dealing with the incident? What are the cleanup costs? What's the investigation time going to be? You know, what's the cost of bringing in a specialist consultant like me if something had gone wrong, if there is blood on the ground? What's the cost from a business cost point of view? So this is where, you know, we work with a company who supply car chair seats to Honda. Now, Honda have a contract clause that says if you slow their production line down, they can bring a claim against you for the cost, and it's £1,100 per minute. So if you multiply that up, that becomes about £70,000 a day. So all of a sudden, there is a cost clause. So you could say, as the senior management team, gosh, weren't we lucky that that was only a near miss? Because if it had been an accident and this had to happen, and we've got an investigation for 2 days and we've had to close that area down, this is the potential knock-on cost. So I always advise people to get hold of this instant cost calculator and just do a sort of back of the fag packet, you know, calculation, because all of a sudden you'll find that that small incident that you really haven't thought much about potentially could have had a cost of £20,000, £50,000, £100,000, depending on. And so it's learning the lessons, not just from the accidents, but also from the near misses that we need to look at. So that's our financial side of, you know, why we really want to start looking at health and safety. But we also have this legal side that we have to take into consideration. Now, what we have to think about here is that the HSE have numerous powers, the health and safety executive. So if an inspector comes and visits you and comes in and does an investigation, if they find something wrong, they can just give you a verbal piece of advice, you know, your toilet needs cleaning or something like that. They can just send a letter to your chief executive saying, you really need to just get this sorted out. But what they can do is they can serve an improvement notice to you. So an improvement notice is what it is on the tin. You know, it's something you need to improve. So they come in and they find you haven't got risk assessments. So they say, well, look, it's a legal obligation. You've got to have risk assessments in place. So we're going to, we're going to give you a set period of time to get your risk assessments in order. So what happens is they will specify the breach. They will tell you what they want you to do, and then they'll give you a reasonable time frame, normally 21 days, to actually get it rectified. And what you do is you do the rectification, and then you write to the HSE and say, look, here is the evidence that I've done the rectification. And they normally write back and say, thank you very much, that's great. If you disagree with the inspector, you can appeal within the 21-day period. And what you then have is that the obligation to stop work or do the thing they've asked you to do, it then stops until the appeal is heard. So the improvement notice is there and this is how you would improve what you actually do. Now, that's an improvement notice. Now, with a prohibition notice, this is where, as you can see here in the photograph, this is where the inspector is of the opinion that something serious is going to happen straight away. So obviously you've got working at height here, you've got falls from height, you've got materials being thrown down from height. The inspector would stop this activity straight away, and he would prohibit it, or she would prohibit it going through. So what you then have is you say, right, I want you to stop this activity. I want you to do this, this, and this. And in this case, you can't then go back to start working the activity if it's been deferred, because you have to stop until the case has been heard. Now, if you don't stop and you continue on, this is where they can then escalate it to prosecutions. Now, what people don't realize is that if you have an improvement or a prohibition notice served against you, the HSE have a public access point on their website where people can go in, put the name of your company into that website, and it will actually tell people that you've had an improvement or a prohibition notice served against you. So if I was doing a tender, for example, and I wanted to do a due diligence check on your company, Martin, I could put the name of your company in and it would come up and tell me. Now that record normally stays there for 5 years. So there's this lag system that you will have to declare that you've had a run-in with the HSE potentially as it comes through. Yes, Kate, come in, please.
What's that website called?
What I'll do is I'll find it for you. It's on the HSE, and you just put improvement and prohibition notices into their search engine, and it just brings it up on the HSE's website.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now, what people don't realise is that if the HSE find that you are breaking the law, they now have this thing called fees for intervention, or an FFI. So you now have to pay the HSE for their time once they find this material breach. So if they find the material breach, this came in 2012, and in the first year, which is 2012, they raised about £3 million through this system. Last year, pandemic, they raised £17 million through us paying for the HSE to do their job. Now that money goes into the Exchequer, it doesn't go to the HSE, but it would indicate that it's a funding system that potentially is going to go forward. Now what's interesting, this is only for the Health and Safety Executive at the moment, but my professional body thinks that this is being trialled, and at some point the government are going to realise that they're raising £17 million by paying us, or us paying for the HSE. So all of a sudden the local authority inspectors, the environmental inspectors, the fire authorities will all follow, we suspect, the same way, that you will start paying, that if you break the law, you will pay for the inspector to actually come in and identify what's going on. So this is if they notice that you are breaching the rules in some way. So it could be that they come in for an accident investigation. It could be that they just come in and do a visit and they find you're in breach of the legislation. So what's going to happen is that the inspectors, as I say, will make sure, and they will stipulate and say, this is why we are serving the improvement notice, this is why we're serving the prohibition notice, so that they can then start charging for their time. Now, at the moment, and it went up on the 1st of April this year, they can charge £160 an hour for their time. So if you think, and this is from not just from when they find the breach, this is for the whole of the time that they're with you. So if they find a breach and they're on site with you for a day, let's say it's a 10-hour day, then that's £1,600 that you are going to have to pay the inspector. If there's 2 inspectors there, it just gets doubled. They don't charge for their travelling time, but they do expect to be paid on 30 days. Now, if you disagree with the inspector, again, you can appeal it, but what happens is you've got 21 days in which to appeal it. But what we're advising is to actually pay the fine or pay the fee for intervention and then dispute the invoice. Because if you don't pay, then it starts to escalate. So you've got this situation that you have to look at. So this is fees for intervention. So if an inspector is on your site and they find a problem, you are potentially going to start paying £160 an hour for their visit to your site as it comes through. Now, the other thing that we have to look at, because this is all about the punishment side of it, is that you also have this thing called the sentencing guidelines. Now, a lot of people don't know about this, and it's a relatively new change. It came in 2016. So it's only been with us for the last 5 years. But what happens is that the justice system, through the Sentencing Council, said the seriousness of the offence has got to be taken into consideration, and therefore achieving the objectives of showing that where an offence results in a loss of life or serious injury, fines are going to be punitive. So not so much for you, Kate, but certainly Martin, for your organisation, then this is something you're going to have to worry about. Now, you can download the document. It's about 50 pages long, the Sentencing Council's guidelines on this. But I'm going to show you some of the bits and pieces that go with this. But just to give you an understanding of what the costs have jumped from, it used to be the Magistrates Court had a cap of £20,000. This has now been removed. So now we've got unlimited fines at a Magistrate Court level. If you go up to the Crown Court, it's unlimited fines, but they can also now imprison you for up to 2 years. So just to give you a flavour of this, pre-2016, the average fine was £27,000. Last year, it has now jumped to £110,000. And that was down because we're in the pre-pandemic, we were running at £150,000 fines. Pre-2016, the highest fine that had been imposed in all the courts in the country was £750,000. So we hadn't had any £1 million claims. All of a sudden, this year, just gone, we've had 7 over £1 million, of which the highest was 2.3 million. Now, obviously, the one I was just talking to you, Martin, about will fall into this year's figures, which is the highest one of 6.2 million, which is the highest one that's been imposed so far. Now, what people don't realise is that this is what's now driving a lot of changes within senior management organisational thinking, because all of a sudden these fines are escalating exponentially. So what you need to think about is that this issue of they're focusing on the risk and not just the consequence. And this is a totally different change, because it used to be blood on the ground, somebody's been hurt, therefore we're going to punish you. Now the courts are looking at it to say, well, the risk was there. You could have killed somebody. You were just lucky that you didn't kill them and they suffered a minor injury, but we are going to punish you as though you could have killed the person. So it's not just the blood on the ground situation, it's and you could have injured this person. So this is a total change of thinking to say, well, what is the risk that you've incurred? They're also looking at making people more accountable, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. But if you're a director of the company, and I suspect both of you are directors or senior managers, under the Health and Safety at Work Act, we have this thing called Section 37, which is the one that targets you as the senior managers. So you can now be prosecuted. You could always have been prosecuted, but now they're becoming much more focused on saying, well, did you consent to the unsafe working practice? So did you know it was happening? Have you?
Can I add a point to that, Alistair?
Yeah, please, Martin.
I think the other thing, these fines are crippling. The other thing which can be crippling, which people don't often think about, is liability insurance. If you claim more than once or twice, actually the cost of getting an insurance can put you out of business.
Yeah,
it can be.
Oh, very much so.
And also the payment need, i.e. the excess. You know, I know a friend who runs a large international business. His excess was at around 4 million.
Wow.
Before they, the insurance company paid out. And it starts to be, can we afford to stay in business because of the price of insurance?
Yeah, if you can get insurance.
Yeah.
Under certain circumstances. And this is the problem, is you start to be seen as an unsafe risk. And this is when we come to talk about the management at work regs in a few minutes time, to say, and look, these are the things you should be doing, so that if an insurance company looks at you, you can say, well, look, we do these things, and they go, oh yeah, you're a safe pair of hands, we're happy with you as it comes through. But this is the problem, is that some managers, they just think, oh, it's the company. And what's now happening is that the focus is very much becoming on, well, if you're neglectful in your duties, if you don't go out and actually make sure your company is doing the things you're meant to do, and something goes wrong, then we're going to come and start having a conversation with the directors. And we also have to look at that. We've got to say to our staff as well, it's not just us, the senior managers, it's the law allows for the health and safety executive to come after the employees as well. So if you don't do the things that we ask you to do and something goes wrong, you as individuals can be prosecuted. And the case, funnily enough, just before the pandemic, this particular one happened here, which was about a scaffolder. So this was a photograph taken by an HSE inspector, retired. And you can see the gentleman here, he's got his harness, but he's not attached to anything. He's got no edge protection. He's got an apprentice with him just here, who he's obviously not mentoring properly. And the inspectors went to prosecute the company, and the company said, well, hang on a sec. And they showed them all their risk assessments and their method statements and the training records and all the things they've done to do the things that this person should be doing. And the HSE said, no, you're quite right. You as an organization have done everything you should do. And they went and prosecuted the individual, who was then sacked by his company for gross misconduct. But you can see here, you know, that he got a £650 costs occurred against him. But also, you know, he had a sentence of up to 26 weeks in prison brought against him, which was suspended for 12 months. So you're looking at, you know, 6 months in prison here for this individual if he was to become a repeat offender within the next 12 months. So all of a sudden, not so much for your team, Kate, but certainly Martin, for your team, yeah. I think there's a safety briefing or a toolbox talk there to just remind them that actually we are doing everything to protect you. But if you step outside of our protection, the law does allow them to come after you as part of this process. Now, what's happened is that you can see here that the judges under these sentencing guidelines have been given a 9-step process to go through. So they will now work their way through this process. Now, I'm not going to go into this in depth, but just to give you an idea, is that the types of questions that the judge is asking themselves is, well, is it a deliberate breach of the rules? Have you put profit over safety? Can I see that you are prioritizing that rather than looking after your staff? That would put you into a very high category of culpability. Or is it that actually you've got systems in place, but for some reason there was a failure here, and I can see that as a judge. Now, what you have is that the judges now have these brackets or these boxes to work within. So certainly for you and I, Kate, we're in the micro business here, which is the under £2 million turnover. So if we didn't do anything to look after our staff, if we had no safety policies, if we had no risk assessments, we didn't send them on any training courses, and something bad happened, the judge can start at £12,000 and go all the way up to £450,000 as a fine. Okay. Now, the more that you do to write your safety policies, do your risk assessments, do your training of your staff, it moves it down into this lower area. Now, for you, Martin, I suspect you're up in the smalls, or are you nudging?
Yeah, we're sort of small on the boundary of both. So we're sort of 10 million going just above. So
yeah,
right on that boundary.
So you're on this boundary, but that basically means you're veering somewhere between a £1.6 million fine and a £4 million fine if you don't do all the things that you are meant to do. And this, as I say, it's new legislation. It's come in, it's 5 years, so it's being tested as we come through. But what we find is that the adjustments, the judge can now make adjustments. So if there's aggravating factors, so if you've had previous convictions against you, so that's your improvements in your prohibition notices. If it's demonstrated that you've got a poor health and safety record, if you're not looking after your staff, that's going to move you up the bracket. If obviously you can show that you have a good safe pair of hands, you've got good safety management systems in place, you've got high cooperation with the inspector during the investigation, and you can show that you've got a safety management system. So this here is based on what we call HSG 65, which is the safety management system of how you put things together. So if you look at it and say, well, I've got a policy, I've got my risk assessments, I train my staff, I make sure I do my investigations, I make sure at the end of the year, I check that all these things are happening. So you work around this circle on a plan, do, check, act model, then you can show that you're doing all the things that you should be doing. Now, as I said to you, it's not just money, it's also the judge now has to start looking at what they can send you to prison for. So if it's low culpability, you might just get a conditional discharge and a slap across the wrist. If they can start saying, well, look, you were reckless and that you've not looked after your staff, then you could start with a 1-year custodial sentence, but it could go up to 18 months because they've given a bandwidth to look at. If you've obviously just prioritized money over the top of it, you could be looking at 2 years in prison. And we're now seeing in the last year alone, we've had about 45 people sent to prison for various breaches of health and safety legislation, which wasn't the case, very much wasn't the case pre-2016. Now, just to give you an idea, obviously, I suspect you're aware of Alton Towers and the 2 young ladies who lost their legs and had a leg amputated. So this was the highest case or highest fine up until the one I was just speaking about that's just come in the last month or so. But the way the judge put this together, it's quite useful for me as a safety consultant because they now tell us how they've put together their fines. So they said, right, it was a high risk of harm because of the nature of the activity. There was a high degree of culpability with a high turnover because they turned over £50 million as the Merlin Group. That put them into this bracket of £2 to £6 million. If you declare early that you are guilty, they will reduce your fine by 1/3. If you get to the court and start defending yourself, they won't reduce your fine. So an early plea can get the reduction done down. So they declared an early plea and the judge took that into consideration, which is why it was a £5 million fine and not a £6 million fine. But there were no risk assessments in place for the task and activity of actually rescuing people from this. Now, it's all about foreseeability. You know, I look at something and say, what's the foreseeable risks associated with that? Well, it's foreseeable that if a roller coaster did break down, you've got to get up there to rescue people. Well, they hadn't looked at that particular process. And one of the girls nearly bled to death whilst they were trying to get up there with the emergency services building a scaffold underneath them to rescue them. They hadn't thought about how the emergency services were going to get into each of the roller coasters and who calls the emergency services. So there was about a 10-minute delay because somebody thought somebody else was actually making the phone call to the emergency services. So these are the things that the judge has taken into consideration when he looks at it. So that's the punishment side of it. So what we've got to look at is, well, what are we going to do to make sure these things don't happen to us? So this is where the Swiss cheese comes in, which is, I'm sure, what enticed everybody into this particular conversation. But the Swiss cheese model is very simple, and it's quite a useful thing just to sit down with your staff and use as a safety briefing or a toolbox tool. But for the incident to occur here, so this could be an accident, this could be a near miss, it's got to come through our defenses. So these are our controls that we're putting in place. So our best control is an engineering control. So an engineering control is anything you can touch or feel. So like a fire door is an engineering control, for example. Okay, a guard on a machine is an engineering control. A barrier is an engineering control. Then you've got your administrative or procedural control. So this is anything you write down on a piece of paper. So this is your permit to work systems, Martin. This is your risk assessments. This is your safety procedures. This is your safety policy.
Can I just add shouldn't there be one in there which says, do we have to carry out this hazardous operation in the first place before you get to the engineering controls?
You could do. I mean, we're working on the basis that this thing is going to happen to a certain extent, because this is on the basis of foreseeability. So you've looked at the jobs and the tasks that you are doing, and you're going to say, well, yes, if we can, when we get into controls in a minute, we'll talk about eliminate, which is the question you just asked there. But then we get into behavioral controls, which is what I class as the soft skills. So this is your culture, this is your training. And then afterwards, you've got your mitigating factors. So if something actually does go wrong, how are you going to deal with it? So this is your first aid arrangements and your fire marshals and people like that. which obviously if you haven't got a first aider, then the incident and the consequences are going to get much worse as against if you did have a first aider in place. Now, what you and I have to do is to continuously look at our business and see these holes opening up. So if we decide to go into purchasing another business, that's going to create new holes. If we decide to start a new production line, that's going to create new holes. So what we have to do is we have to do a safety walk around our business. We have to do inspections. We have to do audits. We have to have staff reporting systems because they have an obligation to tell us about issues and problems, which will then allow us to start covering over these holes. And the more of these holes we can cover over, the more likely we're not going to have an incident actually happening. The trouble is, these are in a continuous state of flux. So they're opening and closing. So we get a new staff member joining our team, that will open up a hole until we've actually given them some induction training and make sure that they've been with us and gone through the processes. So moving into a new building, all of these things will open up until we actually start putting the controls in place. So this is what we mean by the Swiss cheese. It's this continuous flux of holes opening up and looking at how the system is going to go through. So what we have to do, or what the law requires us to do now, since 1992, when the European six-pack arrived, we now have this legal obligation to do risk assessments. It's a must do. So it's what we call an absolute duty. So the risk assessment basically says, go out and have a look at your business and try to identify the hazards that are going to affect you. Now, I put this as a risk assessment machine. So at the top here, you've got a particular task or activity, and you feed information in. So the more information and the better the information you can feed into your risk assessment, the better the safe system of work will be that comes out the bottom. So go and look at what your rivals are doing, go and look at what the HSE says you should be doing, go and look at what the best practice guides within your business are, put that information in. Identify your hazards. So have I got a physical hazard? So that's manual handling, electricity, holes in the ground. Is there a biological hazard? So that would be COVID, for example. Is there a chemical hazard? So that could be a dust, a fume, or a vapor that my staff are coming into contact with. So this is where we've got to identify these hazards. Then we've got to decide, well, who is going to be affected by it? So that could be our contractors. It could be visitors to the premises. It could be children. It could be the elderly. It could be people with a disability. So you've got to think about your business as a cardboard box. Anything that comes into the cardboard box becomes your responsibility. So if you don't want things inside your cardboard box, then we set up defensive hurdles around it to ask relevant questions. Okay, so if you've got a child under 4 inside your cardboard box, you've got to start thinking like a child who is 4, because they won't understand science, they won't understand things, they don't have a conceptual awareness of it. So you have to think and anticipate what's going to happen. You've got to look at your controls that you're going to put in place, and then you've got to record and implement your findings. So if you find there's a problem or an issue, well, what are you going to do about it? And then right at the end, you're going to review your risk assessment. So if anything changes, this is the key word. So if you've got a change of personnel, change of legislation, change of location, then you redo your risk assessments as it comes through. Now, to help with this, we use something called an ABBY. So an ABBY is where you do above, below, behind, and inside. So go and walk around your premises, stand still and just look above you. So are there any issues or problems that you can see? Have you got, for example, a smoke detector in your office? Okay, well, if you have, who's servicing and maintaining it? Is it being done? When was it last done? So you start generating these questions of what's and whys and whens and hows. And you look at those action verbs. So if you're looking below you, well, what's the carpet condition like? If I'm doing my walk around inspection, is it threadbare on the staircase? So falls on staircases are one of the major hazards in offices. And my only fatal accident investigation I've had to do was a lady catching the Hoover on a handrail and falling down the stairs and breaking her neck. So you start looking at those types of situations, and it's that foreseeability question here of, could I foresee a problem happening? because if I can, then I've got to do something about it. So we then, look behind things, obviously look inside things. You open doors. If the door says keep locked, electrical cupboard, we'll try to open the door. It should be locked. If it opens, well, if somebody's using it as a storage cabinet and you've got all your paper in there, which obviously adds fuel to a fire, 1 in 4 fires start from an electrical point of view. So all of a sudden, I've got a fire risk to my building. So this is where we call it doing an abbey, just using this as a tip to go and have a walk round. And the controls, as you said, Martin, this is known as ERIC SP. So if you go and do an IOSH Managing Safely course, Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, this is their sort of mnemonic for controls, but this is what we call a hierarchical list. So you always start at the top and work your way down. So eliminate, if you can eliminate the problem, great, get rid of it, it's no longer a problem. Can I reduce the problem in some way? So 240 volt electricity will kill me, 18 volt battery operated tools won't. So I've reduced the problem in some way. Can I isolate the problem? So I put a barrier between me and vehicles moving. Now, the first 3 are all not involving human beings because we're not very good at health and safety. We will find ways of dodging around it. The controls bit is when we start introducing written controls. So this is your permit to work systems, this is your safe systems of work and things like that. So anything that's written down comes into that bit, but we look at it in this list. We've then got to look at, do we have a safe system of work? So have we got a procedure for doing this activity? So can we do step 1 and then step 2 and then step 3? And then right at the end, we've got our personal protective equipment because it's last, because it only protects the individual who wears it. Okay, so it's always the last line of defense. Now, it may well be that one thing will sort the problem out. It might be that you use multiple bits of this to control the hazards that your staff are potentially going to come up against. Now, what do we then have to do? So this is where we now just get into the management at work regulations. And I've got about 10 minutes just to sort of take you through this before there's any questions. But Regulation 3 says do risk assessments. Regulation 4 says use the principles of prevention, which are your controls. Regulation 5 says as a business, as you said, Kate, as soon as you get to the point of employing 5 or more people, this is the introduction of you need to have a safety policy. And you need to have a system where you plan, organize, control, monitor, and review your protective measures. So you have to have a safety management system that allows you to do all of those things. Now, if you use HSG 65, which is the Health and Safety Executives Guide for setting up a safety management system, they use this plan, do, check, act model, which is very easy to do. Now, what I would suggest, especially for those of you who are senior managers, is that the Institute of Directors worked with the Health and Safety Executive to put together a leadership guide. Now, it's only 12 pages long, and especially for you, Kate, I would recommend you download this because it's got the reference number here. But at the back of it, there are 10 key questions. And as a director of a company, if you can answer those 10 key questions, it really means you're in quite a good position to defend any potential claims that come at you. So it's like, how am I engaging with health and safety? How does communication work? Have I got communication with my staff, and how does that work? So as I say, it's only a 12-page guide, really useful. And I do a 1-day course on leadership. And the only document we use is this document, because we can feed back into it. So it's a really useful guide to actually have. Now, what the law also says is that you are meant to have access, you being the company, to competent health and safety advice. So this is where we come in to an organization, because if you haven't got that advice in-house, then you need to externalize it. So we work with a number of companies, and we have retainer services with a number of companies who employ us for our expertise. The entry level to be deemed as competent for this particular piece of legislation is the NEBOSH General Certificate, which is a 2-week course with a 6-hour written exam and a project that you have to do. So if you want to do it, then you have to find someone who is going to commit that amount of time to bring it in-house as a starting point. But what you've got to look at is that you've got to find a way that you cooperate with your staff and with other people to make sure this information goes backwards and forwards of health and safety. Are we doing it right? Now, the other things you have to look at, because I'm just working my way through the regulations to sort of give you a feel now, is that the law basically says you have to anticipate the problems within your organization. So, for example, Kate, your staff, I suspect, drive and go and visit clients as and when they go out and about. So that's a foreseeable risk for you. For Martin, your team, emergency procedures, coming into contact with high voltage electricity, as you say, 11,000 kV, that's an emergency procedure that you can predict. Now, within your business, you could also predict fires, you can predict floodings, you can predict gas leaks, for example. So if it's a foreseeable risk, you're meant to plan for it. So this photograph here, we do work with Salisbury Cathedral. And one of the issues inside the cathedral is if somebody was to have a heart attack in the top of the spire, how do you get them down? Well, what they do is they open up a trap and they lower people down through into the chapel below. And the rope access team from the fire brigade come and practice this exercise normally on a yearly basis in anticipation of it being a foreseeable risk. So that they've planned for that eventuality, for that task. Wow. The other thing, sorry, was that a question?
No, I was just impressed.
All right, okay. Well, but the other thing is that you've got to think about how do you contact the emergency services and how do you get them onto your site, where are they going to be and where's the location? So you have to think about these things. So the legislation is very clear. You've got to anticipate this. The other thing you have to think about is that you've got to think about information for your employees. Now, the Health and Safety at Work Act says you've got to inform, instruct, train, and supervise your staff. Okay, so as part of that process, you need to think about, well, I've done my risk assessments. I now know what my hazards are. Here is the training I need to make sure my staff have, but also here is the information I need to make them aware of. So when they come to me, do staff inductions, take them through what the health and safety briefings are, how to get out of buildings, raise the fire alarm, those types of things, but also just making them aware of this is the type of training we expect you to do. We need to think about making sure that where we've identified our serious and imminent dangers, such as fire and floods, that we tell our staff how they deal with those particular situations. So there's a jigsaw puzzle, it all links together. This is what's nice about the management at work regulations. It is very much a jigsaw puzzle orientated activity. The other things that it says is that you need to think about cooperation and coordination. So Kate, are all your staff working from home or do you have shared offices somewhere?
Yeah, no, we all work from home. We do have a virtual office at the Science Park in Bristol, but since COVID, we've just all been at home. And actually, we don't go. I took the business totally online, so even meeting clients now, we do that all virtually. We don't go out in our cars and meet with clients and candidates anymore either. So it's literally just purely at home.
Purely at home. Okay. And Martin, with you, do you have all your own offices or do you share with other people?
We do have our own offices, but at the moment we've got a kind of mixture of people working within the office, i.e. those who do direct manufacture and home working. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing here is the regulations say that if you share with other people offices, then you're meant to share health and safety. So, if we were on the ground floor and somebody was us on the first floor and somebody was on the second floor and we all tested the fire alarms on different days, then there's going to be chaos, or we had fire drills on different days. So we can agree to come together to do health and safety collectively. So the regulations actually allow us to coordinate our health and safety response. So you could have first aiders and you could share first aiders if you wanted to. More importantly, though, if you pick up one of your members of staff and you put them into another business, you are meant to tell that business the risk that your person is bringing to that business. But also that business has an obligation to tell you about the risk that your staff member might face whilst they're inside their cardboard box. So you've got this sharing and cooperation of information before it becomes a problem. So if we were going to go and do a hot works activity, we would tell the client the potential risk that we're bringing into their business before it actually happens, and the controls that we're going to have in place. And what this very neatly links into is sort of making sure that you've got control of contractors, because if they're coming into your cardboard box, they're becoming your responsibility. So these three Herberts, I took a photograph of. This is a client's premises, and they came down and we had a conversation, and they said, oh, well, it's all a bit of a game, isn't it, mate? And you know, their attitude was that they'll get away with it until somebody challenges them. And then when I saw them later, they were all suited and booted, they were all working correctly. But this photograph actually cost their company a £250,000 contract, because I showed it to the chief executive of this company that I was there doing an inspection for, and she dismissed the company from their approved selectors list because she said, look, I can't trust them if they're going to behave like that, because if anything goes wrong and they injure somebody, it's damage to my reputation, but it's also a potential claim that my insurance company might have to do. So she took the view that that was it. So what we need to think about is, if you are going to have contractors coming onto your site, think about, you know, health and safety policies, think about their risk assessments, ask about their previous clients, do a bit of due diligence, see if they've got any enforcement actions, go and have a look at that database that I was telling you about on the HSE's website, because you as a company have a legal obligation to make sure that you've done due diligence checks on the contractors that you're employing. And if something goes wrong, then that brings us a problem. Oh, I've got a chat thing come up. Oh, that's very exciting. Who's chatting at me? Right, okay. Right, in that case, we're almost at the last slide. Thank you for that. What we've just got is remind your employees that they also have a duty to report anything that they consider a safety risk. Okay, so blocking a fire exit, they've got to come and bring that to your attention. We have this thing called SODIT. SODIT stands for see it, own it, do it. So if you see a problem, and you can own it, then get them to do something about it. Okay, if they can't own the problem, then their obligation is to come and tell you that there is a problem. So again, Martin, this is another little mnemonic that might be quite useful for your teams as part of that safety briefing on behavioural safety, as an empowerment culture for your staff to look at. Just to finish off, it just so happens that this week is also Safety Door Week during the 20th to the 26th. And there's some very good information on the Fire Door Safety Week guide, with some very interesting videos about people being caught in fires and how they become overcome by the smoke and what fire doors actually do. So I was just going to end with saying, go and have a look at that, because it's something certainly for your, Martin, your offices, it's worth giving consideration to. Right. I almost got it done in the time, but we did start 10 minutes late, to be fair. Any questions? There's only Martin.